So, today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about human communication. I'm going to assume at least a couple of you have communicated with other humans. If you haven't, I recommend you give it a try, right? You'll be really entertained. So we'll talk a little bit about language production and comprehension. We'll talk about disorders of language production and a little bit about disorders of reading and writing.
Did you press record on it?
I did. Did you not see the countdown? Where it did this? And then right on top of that there was this and then that. You want me to check it later?
No, it's fine. I just didn't see it.
Is that helpful? All right. So, language and communication, these are very, very important aspects. Humans being a social species, this is probably right up there with that sort of reproductive behaviors as being some of the most important, right? We think about some other things that we might think, well, those are really important, but we take those things, we think they're important because we put more effort into them, maybe, right? Most folks who do not have a disorder of language, either production or comprehension, we take it for granted, right? That people are able to convey their ideas, they're able to understand other folks' ideas, and get that across. Typically, we think about language, but or speech when we think about language, but language goes far beyond that, right? Obviously, there's sort of written language, symbolic things, right, that may or may not be written. How many of you, when you get on the elevator? Yeah, that was a horrible drawing. Let's try this. There are buttons that kind of look like that, right? You can press up or down. That symbol means something to you, right? How many of you have ever failed your driver's test because you didn't know what this was? Nobody? Okay, maybe that was just me. True story, Abby. I moved to North Carolina. That was a true story. I had to take a driver's test there because I had to get a driver's license in the state of North Carolina, right? Thankfully, it was just like the written test, right? I didn't have to do the performance test, right? And so I thought, well, I've been driving for a while now. I don't really need to read the book, right? Because it's all the same. Like, don't tailgate an ambulance, don't run over little kids, things like that, right? I was like, I'll be okay. So I take the test, and it's on a computer, and I'm going along, and I'm to the point where if I get one more wrong answer, I fail. And I got to leave without a driver's license, and I'm really upset about this. But they were asking me questions like, if you buy alcohol for a minor, how long will you go to jail? And I was like, I don't know what this has to do with me driving, right? Just I don't plan on doing that, so just let me go on. Then, the next thing I almost failed was like the test where you have to look through the little goggles, and all the lady said was, tell me what you see. Like, okay, I see an upside down triangle. That's okay. She's like, wrong. And the next one's like, now what do you see? I was like, well, I see something shaped like a house, because you have little signs like this, right? It's like a school crossing sign. She's like, wrong. What is going on? The next thing is like this, and it's red. I'm like, oh, I see a stop sign. She's like, yep, correct. It's like, oh, you want me to tell you what road sign it is, not what I see. That's completely different. Because I'm describing to you clearly what I'm seeing, but you're telling me it's the wrong answer. So let's just be clear about the instructions and see what happens. I didn't leave with my driver's license because they had to mail it to me from Raleigh for some reason. So I left with a piece of paper that had my name on it and my address. No picture of me. So I don't know how somebody was going to know it was me because they took my other driver's license from the state I moved from. I was like, what am I going to do with this? Somebody pulls me over and I say, draw a picture. Like, yep, that's me. I don't know. Anybody from North Carolina? No? All right, you should move there. Other than that experience, it was great. Once I got the driver's license, it was fine. So, written, symbolic, and gestural forms, right? How many of you have ever thrown some gestures someone's way, right? Involving one or more fingers and arms, right? That happens. Sometimes you use that one, sometimes you use other ones. It's fine. Gestures, right? And how many of you send these goofy little things to people, right? Or like, I don't know, there's like always like a rainbow with a unicorn thing. like emojis, right? So that's kind of symbolic, and that means something too. There's like some code, right? There you go. Today we are going to talk about sort of, these are the three big areas we're going to talk about. Broca's area. How many of you guys remember Paul Broca? And Tam, we talked about him in the very beginning. It was the patient who showed up and all he could say was Tam, right? So they named him Tam. That's what happens. If that's the only thing you say, that's what people call you. If anybody, I'm still 2 weeks behind. If anybody ruins anything, you're going to fail. But like Honor, for example, if that's the only word you say, that becomes your name. So, right, Casey? So there you go. Kyle, I took that time instead of watching Game of Thrones and graded your exam. Just so you know the sacrifice I made.
You should watch it.
I probably should have. He can wait 2 months on his grade. Wait until the season's over. So, there you go. This is kind of interesting. Thankfully, they did this correctly. Language is primarily processed in your left hemisphere, right? This is almost exclusively true for right-handed folks. If you are left-handed, there's a slim chance that it's not processed in the left hemisphere, and that it's primarily processed in the right hemisphere. Okay? Does that make sense? Anybody left-handed? All right. Great job. Yeah, that was awesome. Signed up for that study yet about left-handed people? You should. Because guess what? One, that'll make me happy because we need more left-handed people to do it. And two, you get extra credit for the class. Send an email to, I'll write this down. Owens 117, and that's at whatever Marshall Live thing you guys have. There you go. So they put this in the left hemisphere. That's awesome. All right. So how do we know sort of things about language production, right? So if we're going to study human language, well, the first thing we do is we have to study humans, right? We can't start like removing parts of a rat's brain that we think are responsible for human language because, well, they're rats and sure they have some way of communicating, right? But it's not the same way we communicate, so the brain structure is different, so there's not really a way that we can do that. Now, if we're talking about movement disorders, if we're talking about some other issues, we can definitely study animal models for that. It's much more difficult when it's a behavior that's sort of exclusive or developed in a sort of unique way in a species, right? Like languages for humans. So we just have to wait around until somebody has something like a cerebrovascular accident, right? Which is basically a stroke. So if they have some sort of occlusion or rupture of a blood vessel in the brain and then part of the brain dies, right? And then we can go, okay, well, how's your language skills these days? And if they're the same, they're like, well, that part of your brain must not be involved in producing or comprehending language. But if there's a deficit, then we can start to deduce what's going on. This will produce something often called an aphasia, right? So we'll talk about Broca's aphasia a little bit and Wernicke's aphasia. These are difficulties either producing or comprehending speech. There are specific types of aphasias that we'll cover later, but it's not related to deafness or to motor deficits, okay? If someone has a problem with their sort of auditory apparatus, their hearing, right? That's not an aphasia. That's not that they have difficulty comprehending speech. They just can't hear. If you give them written language, if you give them other forms of language, they're perfectly fine. There are also folks who have motor cortex strokes. Some of you may know someone who's had a motor cortex stroke and they've lost the ability to use sometimes one or more limbs on the same side of their body. They will often have some speech difficulties, right? They'll have kind of slow or slurred speech because they have difficulty moving the muscles to produce speech. That's not an aphasia either, right? So they can create the speech in their minds. They can send that motor command out. It's just the apparatus to make that sound is not working, right? It's not that they're actually having difficulty creating the words, creating the sentence structure. They're just having difficulty actually, performing that, right? Does that make sense? So that's also not an aphasia. That's not an issue with, for example, Broca or Wernicke's area, okay? It's probably an issue up here in motor cortex and the part that controls the mouth. All right. As we've already said, language is primarily in the left hemisphere, processed in the left hemisphere. This brings up an idea of lateralization, right? And sometimes we'll even say lateralization of function. I do not want you, please, to go out into the world and say, well, I use the left side of my brain more, so I'm more whatever you want to put on there. That's really not how things work, okay? If you start using one side of your brain more than the other, you'll walk in a circle, okay? So please don't do that. That's a problem, right? You're going to use both sides of your brain the same, right? It's also those people who say, well, you only use 10% of your brain. If you only use 10% of your brain, you will die, because you need more than 10% to keep breathing and have your heart run, okay? So please, use it all. Don't use it all at once. That's called a seizure. Use it when you need to, okay? But we have lateralization of function, right? This is when we organize things. How many of you live in a structure that has more than one room? Okay, and if it does have one room, how many of you have things sort of in different places in that room, right, that you're going to do? How many of you have like a bedroom and a kitchen and a bathroom, right? Those are things people know of, right? Why do we have those located in different places? They have different functions, and it makes sense to separate those functions, right? So we can do each of those things just as well. Can you imagine, now I'm just thinking of like an efficiency apartment, where you've got your kitchen, and instead of an island in the middle of your kitchen, you just have a toilet, right? And right around that, I know, right, Bethany, that sounds phenomenal. It's an architectural phenomenon just coming your way. It's the new trend. And you're just going to put a shower curtain around that, and just water will just dump right out of the top. You can just take a shower while you're on the toilet scrambling eggs. You can do it all. No, it doesn't make any sense, right? You want to separate these things out, these functions. It's more efficient that way. It works better, right? Because just think about if your bathroom and your kitchen were the same room, you would have to wait until someone finished cooking breakfast before you could use the bathroom, and that seems like a major inconvenience. Okay? So lateralization of function, we have functions sort of in different places across your brain, right? We have different functions that are carried out in different hemispheres. Okay. We talked about emotion. We said emotion is really processed in the right hemisphere, right? And I know all of you went home and you took pictures of yourself smiling in the mirror, right? Or selfies, and then you like cut those pictures in half, and you're like, oh yeah, the left side of my face is much more smiley than the right side, because the right side of my brain controls the left side of my body, and if emotion is processed more on the right side, then I'm going to be more expressive on the left side of my face, right? So there you go. All right. What about language comprehension? All right, so there are two problems. There's production and there's comprehension, right? If you think about comprehension, one, we need to access something called the mental lexicon, right? It's kind of a dictionary in our brain. We have to access memories, right, of words, okay? Memories of things that have happened. If we are not able to access that mental lexicon appropriately, then we will have difficulty comprehending language. That's kind of cool, right? Recently, there's been some work on bilingualism, right? Is anybody not monolingual? Everybody's monolingual. You only speak one language, that's fine. Are you uncertain?
No.
Okay, because you seemed uncertain about, like, I'm not really sure. So if you're bilingual, there's some different things going on in your brain. There are some, obviously there would be some brain regions that are going to be overlap, right, in both languages, but there are also some regions that are going to be unique to either of those languages, which is kind of interesting. All right. How many of you have ever listened to someone speak a language that you don't comprehend, but yet you can clearly understand that guy did something really bad and she's mad about it, right? Yeah, you can kind of pick up on that pretty easily, right? Because there's something in speech that's that emotional component. Okay? Now this is primarily processed in the right hemisphere, sort of an exception to that left hemisphere language story I gave you. Okay? So there are other parts of speech besides just the words, right? This is also how we understand things like sarcasm, right? You guys do know what that is, right? No answer. That's fine. Anybody watch the show Seinfeld? Who's a Seinfeld fan? Nobody? Yeah, Kyle. I'm a little surprised, but okay, we'll go. You remember the episode where Kramer had the? So this show becomes so difficult to talk about now, but I'm going to anyway. So just bear with me. So you remember the episode where he had and this is why it becomes complicated. He had the role in the Woody Allen movie. Yeah, because like Woody Allen's not on the good list anymore, right? He was for a long time. You guys remember that? So he was like, "These pretzels are making me thirsty." You don't remember that episode? It's a brilliant episode. And the whole time, his only line is, "These pretzels are making me thirsty." But he's spending so much time trying to figure out like what's the emotion behind that, right? Is it like, "These pretzels are making me thirsty," or is it, "These pretzels are making me thirsty," right? And so there are like so many ways you can say "these pretzels are making me thirsty" that might indicate a different kind of background story for his character. And really, he just needed to say "these pretzels are making me thirsty." He ended up spilling beer on Woody Allen, which was kind of like a bad part in the show. But now I'm thinking like, well, that might have actually been the best part of the show. Right, Paris? I mean, I don't know. I tried for a while keeping a list of people I could talk about in public. And the list changed so much, I'm like, I'm done. It's like, I'm just not talking about anybody. Just assuming everyone has done something they shouldn't, and I don't care.
Remember the episode?
You remember the episode? It was a good episode. Yeah. It's like these pretzels are, and then he was like, I think he even ended up breaking glass and cutting Woody Allen. Is that true? You don't remember that much? Just sounds like that's what happened. We'll go with it. So when I ask you about these prosody, I want you to just write pretzels. Or if you can draw a pretzel. I don't even know what a pretzel looks like. I don't think that's a pretzel, but is there like a okay. So just write the word pretzel, so please. All right. Now, how many of you recognize other people's voices? Yeah, right, Brandon. And that's a skill, and that's a skill that comes in handy, right? But here's a way around that sometimes. It's called phonognosia, right? And that sort of looks like the word aphasia, but it's not. It's agnosia, and this happens when there's some damage in parts of the right hemisphere that are processing those other parts of language and speech. You lose the ability to recognize people's voices. Okay? That's pretty crazy, right? So like someone will be talking to you and you're like, I don't know whose voice that is coming out of their mouth. They must be really good at ventriloquism because I don't know who that is. That can be really problematic, right? Like if you had to call someone, you had to talk to them on the phone, you're like trying to tell them about the secret plan that you have, but you don't recognize anybody's voice. You're constantly telling the wrong person what you're going to do.
Do the voices just sound the same, or we just can't hear what person's voice?
You know, I'm not quite certain. I assume they don't sound the same because they have different frequencies and timbre and volume. But I assume they sound different, but they just aren't able to identify. They're like, yeah, that sounds different, but I don't know who it is. Even though it's probably someone they've been listening to their whole life. Does that make sense? All right, so here's sort of a drawing showing that dictionary in your brain. This is Wernicke's area, kind of in the back. It needs to access all of those sort of perceptions and memories, things that you've stored, right? So that you can pull that information out, send that information forward to Broca's area, which is a speech production area, okay? So here's a comprehension, sort of a planning area. We're going to get that information up here for production. If there's damage in some of these pathways, right, that can cause a real problem in your ability to produce speech. If there's damage here in Broca's area, you have a difficult time producing speech. If you have damage in Wernicke's area, you just don't understand speech. Okay? You can produce speech wonderfully. None of it makes any sense, but it does follow the regular rules. Hey, here's a guy's brain. This is like actually a person. This guy was bilingual. He spoke English and French. Okay. What's really kind of interesting about this is he was he actually learned English once he was about 10 or 11 years old. So he learned English later. He was a native French speaker. You see when, see if that shows up better. So when you have brain surgery, I don't know if anybody's had that or not. You don't have to answer that. Again, that's personally identifiable medical information. They don't anesthetize you. And the reason for that is, like if they would accidentally go and jab you right there, then you might lose something important. And so they kind of just poke around gently and they're like, hey, can you still breathe? And you're like, yeah, I'm fine. They're like, okay, we're going to take this part out there. And that's kind of how brain surgery goes. There's a little more finesse to it. They've got like a fancy thing that drills a hole in your head, but other than that, that's the way it happens, right? So just assume if you ever go to a neurosurgeon, that's what they're going to do. So the only time we can study what people's brains really do at this kind of level is when somebody's going in for brain surgery and they're like, you know what, perfectly fine if you just dig around a little bit back there for science. So that's certainly cool. And they did with this guy, and so they had him like name some objects, and they found like these two brain areas get excited when he was naming it in French, but only this area got excited when he was naming in English. You do see that there's some overlap. Those are the same brain regions, but there's that extra brain region there that's involved when he's naming it in French as well. So that's kind of exciting, right? So theoretically, you could lose or have a deficit in one language and not in the other after you've had some sort of brain injury, either due to degenerative disorder or stroke, hit in the head with a hammer. I don't know. Whatever it is you guys do. You cannot get hit in the head and magically pick up a new language, right? Somebody asked me about that once. Like, hey, what about that kid? I read the story where he got hit in the head with a soccer ball and then he could speak Spanish. I was like, well, unless he was speaking Spanish before he got hit in the head with a soccer ball, it wasn't going to happen. So lots of people get hit in the head with soccer balls and they can speak Spanish because they were speaking Spanish before. That's how that works. So just ask me. I just want to be clear about that.
Is there a reason that the French stimulates two regions and the English only one? Is it because it's the native language? Yeah,
so I think, and again, we have such a limited amount of information about this, right? There are so first you got to find people who are bilingual, and then you've got to give them a head injury so that they need a surgery, right? And so then, it's like the population gets smaller and smaller, and then you have to convince them to agree to let us poke around in their brain for a while, while we're doing this, right? We're just going to take our time and see what happens. So it's sort of a small sample, right? I would think it's because this was the first language, and it's going to be more tightly connected with those that mental lexicon, and we're going to have already kind of occupied that space with something, right? But in reality, I'm not sure we actually know. But that's a good question. Casey, I'm going to ask you the name of a movie that I don't remember. It had Brad Pitt in it. It had a deaf Japanese female actress. I think Benicio del Toro was in it, but that might have been another movie I watched at the same time. And there was a tour bus in the Middle East. Does any of that sound like a movie? Somebody's going to look that up. Just put all that in Google and see what comes out. Anybody working on it?
What do we look? Brad Pitt, tour bus, maybe.
Yeah.
Japanese woman, don't forget the deaf Japanese.
Yeah.
No, that's real. There was a deaf Japanese woman. She was a younger woman. She was definitely a woman because of some of what happened in the movie. Like, you can't do that if you're not, like, an actual, legally an adult. Was that the name of it? Sounds like a movie to me. So, I saw that. That's close enough. Yep, I knew there was a desert. Was there a bus?
It really says a deaf Japanese teen undercover.
Yep.
And a Mexican man who takes their young charges across the border without parental permission.
Yep. Now we're getting
They
some.
play the ugly American tourist couple on bus tour.
Sounds reasonable to me. I'm not recommending that movie. I'm not recommending the movie. I don't obviously remember if it was good or not. I did see it. The reason I'm bringing that up is because it was obviously a film that involved people who spoke a variety of languages. And I remember in particular there was difficulty directing the scenes with the young Japanese actress because she was deaf. And so they had to have, like, I think the guy who was directing spoke Spanish, and so he kind of thought about it in Spanish, and then he told somebody what to do in English, and so they had an English translator who spoke Japanese, but they didn't have an English translator who spoke Japanese but also spoke Japanese Sign Language, so then they had to have the Japanese, somebody had to speak that to somebody who spoke Japanese and Japanese Sign Language, right? So you see how this is like becoming a real complicated string. And that's the only reason I bring that up. I think logistically that seems like a complicated thing to direct, right? Because like 5 people had to get that, like, you know, direction translated to that particular actress. So. Has anybody else seen that movie, or is it just me? You guys were probably like 7 when it came out. Is that accurate? When was the movie released? 2006? How old were you guys in 2006? 7? 7, is that right? No, some people were not 7. You can tell people you were 7, it won't bother me. So, there you go. Any questions about that? That wasn't so bad, right? So what about Broca's aphasia? We should talk in detail about that. Probably because I will ask you to tell me about Broca's aphasia. Right, so you should be able to tell me about that. This is damage to Broca's area, or some areas close to Broca's area. So this is like a real problem too, right? So Brandon, I'm going to study brain injuries in humans, right? Okay. And you know people who've had brain injuries. Yeah, right, okay. Were they all the same? No, none of them were the same, right? None of them are the same at all, ever. So if I want to study people who have, brain damage, because I want to study Broca's aphasia, language production, language comprehension, whatever, the problem is each individual is going to have a slightly different set of capabilities, right? Because that damage is not going to be in the right place every time where I wanted it. The spread of the damage might be more or less from person to person, right? And so occasionally what you see is someone will describe Broca's aphasia with these 5 characteristics. And somebody else will say, well, it is those 5, but it's also this 6th one. And then somebody else will say, well, it's only these 4, right? And it's because each person has a slightly different extent of that damage and location where that's centered. So each person, it might vary a little bit, but what we can do is sort of distill all of those problems and see what are the common things we see in each of these cases, right? And then kind of define the disorder or the aphasia around that. So, with Broca's aphasia, folks have slow, sort of labored, non-fluent speech, right? And what we mean by that is if someone is trying to describe a scene, someone is trying to tell you what's going on, they're not very good at that, right? They can occasionally get out the important keywords, right? They're going to get out the nouns, they're going to get out the verbs, and that's going to be about the end of it, right? They're not going to give you those fun little prepositions and connecting words in between, right? So if they were trying to tell you, I went to the grocery store, and while I was at the grocery store, I tripped and fell on a can of green beans, and I busted my knee, okay? So that seems like an interesting story, right? I'm sure some of you put that on Instagram or whatever you use now to share things people don't care about. If you had Broca's aphasia, it might come out like store, trip, beans, knee hurt, right? I understand what happened. You went to the store, you tripped on some beans, and now your knee hurts, right? But I didn't get all the words in between, okay? These folks do not have a problem with comprehension. So if you talk to somebody with Broca's aphasia, you don't have to change what you're saying. You don't have to change how you're saying it. You can talk to them just as you would anybody else. You're just going to have to wait a while to get the words back from them and try to figure out what it is they're telling you, right? It's going to take just a little bit of effort. They do have difficulty with grammar, and in particular, there's sort of two kinds of words. There's what we call function words and content words, right? Those content words are easy. They're the nouns, the verbs, the adjectives, right? The function words are the connecting words, right? Prepositions, articles, things like that. They have difficulty with those things. We call that agrammatism, right? Because they have difficulty with grammatical constructs. They will, go ahead.
Oh, so is that only like in producing verbal speech, or that's in like written?
Great question. And I have a slide for that in a few moments, but I will go ahead and ruin
Well, it
this.
didn't say one of two. If it said one of two, I was gonna wait.
So, if you, for any of these difficulties, right, whether that's Broca's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia, whatever, because it's a language issue and not a speech, it's not an issue moving the speech-making apparatus, right? It's a difficulty producing the speech. So, with Broca's aphasia, folks are going to have difficulty with verbal and written language. They're going to have the same difficulty creating, if they try to write something, it's going to be the same thing. They're going to write a word. Keep in mind it's going to be a content word, and then they're going to struggle, and then they'll get out another content word, and then they're going to struggle a little bit more, right? And then they'll get out another content word. Okay, so they're going to have similar issues writing as they would speaking with Broca's. Wernicke's is a comprehension issue, so they're going to have, here in a moment you'll figure out why we have no idea. We're going to assume that they have difficulty understanding or comprehending as well. Okay. Folks with Broca's aphasia also have something called anomia. It's word-finding difficulty. I don't know if any of you have experienced that before. It's pretty common, right? Folks have it all the time. You're trying to, what is that thing I'm trying to tell you about? Pop-Tarts. That's it, and you just have a little difficulty getting the words out. Don't worry about it if it's just sort of, once in a while. Folks with Broca's aphasia, they have this a lot, okay? This is the Boston Diagnostic Aphasia Test. It's just a sample. They'll show folks pictures, and they'll try to get them to describe what's happening. If you were to ask any of us, we might say, well, there's a distracted mother or babysitter, I don't know, washing dishes. Obviously her feet are wet and cold at this point. I don't know, she's probably got some neurological damage. She can't feel her legs. That's what I'm going to assume, because that's a big pile of water. And then these two kids are sort of creative. This is obviously the older sibling who has instructed the younger sibling to do something daring so that they can get some cookies out of this quite large and full cookie jar, right? Seems like a great plan. For those of you that are not older siblings, always watch out, because your older sibling will tell you to do these dangerous things. And this poor kid, he's about to fall off this stool, and I don't know what he's going to do when he hits the ground, but it's not going to be pleasant. Okay? Somebody who has Broca's aphasia, we're going to have difficulty getting that out in a smooth fashion. They might say flood, distracted, kid fall, cookies, right? And you kind of get the idea, like, yeah, all those things are in that picture, right? And that's what's happening. If somebody had Wernicke's aphasia, they might tell you something like, the chair ate a pickle. You're going to have no idea what it's about, and it's not going to be related to anything out in the real world, but that's what they would do. We'll talk about that in a few moments. All right, insular cortex, don't worry there. Wernicke's aphasia. These are folks that have difficulty comprehending. Okay? They can produce speech. The speech they produce follows normal grammatical rules. There is a verb, there is a noun, it's in the right order, right? Things are doing what they should be doing, just none of them are related to the outside world, right? If you walk up to someone who has Wernicke's aphasia and you say, hey, how are you doing today? They really may reply to you, the chair ate a pickle. Now that's a perfectly grammatically correct sentence, right? There is a noun, there's a verb, there's some object in that sentence, a subject in that sentence, things are happening, right? If you were to diagram that sentence with your third grade English teacher, you'd be fine, right? But in terms of that actually being something that can happen in reality or is happening in reality, it's not there. right? Folks with Wernicke's aphasia, they have very fluent speech, but it does not make any sense. It doesn't have, the content doesn't make sense, right?
If they read something that's like right now, can they understand it?
Well, that's the problem. That's the problem. We don't know. They can't. As far as we would assume they can't. Because if we give them a sheet of paper, and then we say, okay, tell us what's on that sheet of paper, cherry to pickle.
I mean, but did they follow instruction? Did they details of instruction?
No. You can tell them go over there and stand, and they might start dancing. They have no idea. No idea. You cannot, because they don't comprehend anything you're saying to them.
The book is a phrase and word is phrase. Does it go hand in hand with Alzheimer's?
Typically, when we think of Wernicke's and Broca's aphasia, we are thinking of sort of an immediate sort of brain injury or accident, right? That's not to say if you had another neurodegenerative disorder that you couldn't develop these issues as well. With Alzheimer's, you do see some brain regions kind of targeted first, but usually it's pretty late in the game before they start to have speech difficulties, and by then there's such a broad deficit of cognitive capabilities, it's really hard to tease out anything. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But if you had just like targeted Alzheimer's on Wernicke's area, yeah, you definitely develop Wernicke's aphasia. Everything else would be fine. But typically, again, we're thinking about, and the other thing we're thinking about with Wernicke's and Broca's aphasia, we're thinking about a situation where there's an accident after you've been an adult, right? So we're not thinking about people who are born with Broca's aphasia or born with Wernicke's aphasia, because it's typically due to a head injury or a stroke. Does that make sense? So you don't see a lot of like kids being born with Broca's aphasia. That's not really something. Does that make sense? So that's the other thing. Like you might ask, well, like maybe this person never had great language skills. Well, in all the cases we have, they did. Just there was a stroke or something, and then after tumor, something like that.
So if someone was born with aphasia, even though they would never learn to speak, and they still like hear people talking and be able to say it, they're just going to be able to recognize what they're saying?
Honestly, I have no idea. I would assume they can hear, and I would assume they can hear words, and I would assume they would mimic those words. But I don't think they would ever be able to connect any of those words to meanings, right? So, you know, like if somebody says, hey, that's a cat, and they keep saying cat, and they point to a cat, and eventually you know that's a cat, right? And that's how things work. When you do this with a person who would have Wernicke's aphasia, if they were born with that, you know, something that really happens, I just don't think they would ever get it. They would hear cat, cat, and I think they could say cat at some point. They would just randomly say cat in the middle of all of the other words that they've said. And I don't know, again, because they would not have, and this brings up a whole big debate about like whether or not, and there's like camps on this, right? So we can think about it at some point if you really wanted to. I'd rather not. There are folks who are like, well, you know, language is a completely learned thing, the structure of that, the syntax and so forth. And then there are folks that are like, well, you know, there's some like genetic predisposition to different types of like rules in language. And so I just don't know if you were, I mean, like theoretically, if you were born with Wernicke's aphasia, I don't know that any of that would ever make sense to you. I don't think you would develop the ability to put together a sentence. I think you have to have that first, and then, you know, does that make sense? I think they just randomly spell out words, which is sort of what they do anyway, but they randomly spout out words in syntactically correct arrangements. But I don't know if you'd be able to do that if you didn't know what those syntactically correct arrangements were in the first place. Does that make sense? Again, that's all speculation. As far as I'm aware, nobody's been born with Wernicke's aphasia or Broca's aphasia.
Is there a reason that some people, like, they're not born with Wernicke's, that they're born with Broca's?
Oh, they're not born with that either. I mean, it's usually a head injury situation. Like you have to have a brain injury or something. It's not a developmental issue. Does that make sense?
What was the connection to motor neurons?
I don't know. You mean mirror neurons?
Yes,
Yeah. So I think sometimes whenever you're like, well, maybe we should just be able to mimic what someone else does, right? And we should be able to make that connection. So you would think that if you saw someone say something, you would be able to connect that with the mirror neurons that you have, right? Because the same neurons should get activated when you say or when someone else says, right? But if there's a disconnect there, and I think that's what they're saying, what they think is going on is that there's a disconnect in that mirror neuron system, because that's what helps connect to those sort of memories that you would have about what that word means. And if that's broken back here, then you're not going to make that connection. Wrong direction. You get the point, right? Don't worry about glass. Do this. Someone asked about conduction aphasia. I mean, basically all conduction aphasia is there's damage in that pathway that gets the information from Wernicke's up to Broca's, which we just talked about. All right. Nobody's asked about this yet. I thought you might if we spent all that time trying to figure out what movie I had seen 10 years ago and couldn't remember the title of. But you didn't. What about like sign language, right? Folks, there have been a handful of folks who have had damage to Broca's or Wernicke's area and use sign language. What we see in individuals who use sign language, they have the same problems. It's a language, right? And I think this drives home the concept that language is not just verbal speech. There's so much more to language. And when you damage those areas that are responsible for producing language or comprehending language, it's not about the motor outputs necessarily as much as it is about a step back from that, right? It's about that planning and that thinking about what's going on. And with sign language in particular, that happens. So if someone has Broca's aphasia and they use sign language to communicate, they have slow, labored signing, they have difficulty finding the right sign to use, and they're only going to use sort of those, some of those content, they're not going to have, it's going to be kind of that smooth sort of signing that you would normally anticipate. If somebody had Wernicke's aphasia and they use sign language, they would sign all kinds of stuff very smoothly, but again, none of it would be connected to reality, as far as we can tell. Then you wonder if we don't all have Wernicke's aphasia, right? And like maybe they're the one person who doesn't. But kind of give people, panic attacks there. Kyle, how's it going back there? I noticed. We appreciate it, by the way. You're going to be here next week? Yeah, it's going to be a review. It's going to be phenomenal. Who cares about rhyming? Stuttering. Hey, we should talk about stuttering, though, right? Stuttering is actually kind of an interesting phenomenon right there. A number of folks who stutter when they speak. There's actually a study a few years ago where they looked at the white matter tracks in individuals who stutter, and what they found is that there was decreased white matter beneath what's called the ventral premotor cortex. And what's interesting about this particular pathway is it provides you with feedback about what you've said, right? So when you say something, let's say there's a sentence, you want to say that sentence, whatever that is. Let's say you want to just read out prolongations of sounds, right? I don't know. For whatever reason, that's the phrase you want to say. How do you know, Scotty, that you've said that? Well, you heard yourself say it, right? You can hear yourself speak. So you're like, okay, I said that, I can move on. When someone stutters, what happens is that pathway that gives them that feedback is disrupted, and so they'll read along, and all of a sudden they get to a point where they didn't get the feedback that that particular syllable or that particular word had actually been said. And so what do? You continue to repeat that word or syllable until that feedback comes through that, yes, you've said it, and then you can move on forward, right? This is why individuals who stutter don't tend to stutter when they're singing in a group, don't tend to stutter when they're reciting with a group, because they're getting that feedback from other folks that those words have been said, and they can sort of continue to speak smoothly. It's kind of interesting, right? It's kind of cool. For folks who have had some sort of intervention with stuttering, what they will actually see is an increase in the thickness of those white matter tracts there over time, right, as their stuttering improves. All right, there's a chart. You don't need that. This is just for you, Meg. Your reading and writing skills, if you have an aphasia, they're typically the same, right? Whatever that is. If you have difficulty producing speech, you're going to have difficulty writing things on paper. If you have difficulty comprehending speech, you're going to have difficulty comprehending what it is you read. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, awesome. We should talk briefly about pure Alexia, right? This is when you lose the ability to read, but you did not lose the ability to write. This is kind of interesting. So folks can't read anything, but they can definitely write stuff. And what's interesting is they can't even read what they've written, right? So if you were, like, let's say you wanted to write your own notes, that's awesome, but you had pure Alexia, you'd never be able to go back and read them. You could write someone a letter, but you'd never know if you made a mistake because you're like, oh, I'm not sure what I wrote there, but I hope it was right. I know, right? Isn't that fascinating?
So you think the words, and you know what you're saying when you think about them?
And you write it down.
And you put it on paper and like you forgot?
That's it. No, you didn't forget. I mean, you can remember what you wrote, assuming, you have some memory capabilities. You just can't go back and read it. You can say, well, what I meant to say there was this. That's what I remember writing, but I can't go back and read it and confirm that. So the next time you send a stupid email, maybe you can say I had a brief attack of pure Alexia. I couldn't go back and read it, but I knew I needed to send it to get it to you. Nobody's ever... I'm trying to give you all of these tips, right? Because how many of you have ever been in trouble with another person because of your communication with that person, right? Either verbal or written communication. Didn't quite go the way you planned it to go, right? It happens, right, Jay? It happens to the best of us. Trust me, because it's happened to me. So that's how I know it happens to the best of us. So what I'm trying to do is give you a few scientific excuses, right? So the next time you're like, I'm really sorry, I thought that was you. I must have had some phonologia and I didn't recognize your voice. And the lights were out, so I couldn't see you. Gonna have to add an extra layer there for certain activities. There we go. Some people got it. The rest of you were like, no, I got no idea. Why would you have the lights out? I don't know what you guys do with your time. So I read a study, I saw in the news, and I said, here's the problem. I mean, I guess it's not a real problem on one level, but on another level it is, right? People are having less sex now than ever. And I think that's a problem. Right, Casey? You were shaking your head back there. Was that me or something else? Something else? Okay. Thought you were paying attention to class, but that's okay. Your grading test. All right. So there you go. I think that's, we're just spending too much time on the old Twitter and video games and other such activities. All right. Questions about that? Nobody has questions. Okay. So let's actually think about reading a little bit. I've recommended you do this like the whole semester for you to read. I think some of you have, right? We'll figure out who has when we look at final grades. So there are a couple ways you can read things. One is called whole word reading, right? We kind of think about these like sight words. How many of you are familiar with those, right? Like little short words you've seen before. Sometimes they can be quite long words that you don't have to really spend much time processing, right? You're like, oh, I know that word. That's a long word, but I've got it, right? The other way to do this is phonetic reading. It's when you have to kind of like sound out the words, right? So you have to kind of sound out each syllable. So I think about this class, and there were probably at the beginning of the semester a lot of words that were going to be phonetic words, right? So what about amygdala, right? So words you probably had to sound out even on amygdala, right? You're just like going through the process. Maybe by now, if you see the word amygdala, you can just read that instantly, right? You know that now, you've become familiar with it, so it's now a sight word for you, right? And so you can just kind of process that, oh, amygdala, I know what that is, and you can just move on. Okay? There are different kinds of dyslexia. Please don't use this like, oh, I'm dyslexic because I was trying to write the word, I don't know, what's a word people try to write? Friend, but you mixed up your 2 letters. That's not being dyslexic. That's just, oh, you mixed up 2 letters. So don't worry about it and move on, okay? Dyslexias are sort of specific and unique, and there are some things we'll talk about on this. I don't even think, and Casey, you'll know far more about this than I will. What's that big book that you live by? Yeah, the DSM, right? I don't even think it has the word dyslexia in it, right? It's like reading disorder.
Yeah, I don't think that's.
Yeah, I don't think you can actually get diagnosed with dyslexia according to that. So if it's not in the DSM, it doesn't exist, right?
We can't diagnose it.
You can't diagnose it. I wouldn't live by that statement. So one type of dyslexia is called surface dyslexia, right? You can read, so that's when you have to read words phonetically, right? You're going to have difficulty reading words using the whole word method if they're spelled irregularly. So what do we mean by that? So how many of you know this word? Enough, right? So you're like, I've had enough of this class, I'm going to leave. So I use that in a sentence. So if you were to try to pronounce that phonetically though, right? You might pronounce it in alga, right? Because there's like, who says this becomes an right? So if it was like enough, it should be spelled that way, right? And if you're going to pronounce it phonetically. So someone who has like surface dyslexia, they're going to have difficulty with some of those irregularly spelled words because they're going to have to read the words phonetically. They're not going to be able to read them using that sight word method, right? So if you see this word, I think for most folks the word enough is a sight word at this point in your life, right? Most of you are, in your 2nd or 3rd decade or so of life, and you kind of know what's going on. Or at least you think you do. And so you can read the word enough because you read that, you don't read it phonetically, you read it as a sight word, right? It's one of those words probably like your, 2nd grade teacher, I don't know when you learned to read, spent a lot of time trying to tell you how to read this, and you're like, you just have to say it. It's enough, just move on, don't worry about it, right? It doesn't follow the rules we taught you for everything else. But if you had surface dyslexia, you'd have a real problem with that. There's direct dyslexia. Okay. That's if you can, this is kind of a weird one, you can read words out loud, but you have no idea what they were. You can read very familiar words, words that you, again, this is going to be something that's going to happen to you sort of after the fact. So you can read familiar words, but you can't read words phonetically. So you can only read sight words. So if you came up on a word, mesoacumble, right? Okay. That's a word that might be in your book somewhere. It's not a word you really need to worry too much about right now, but I'm assuming that's not a sight word for any of you, right? That's a word you would not be able to read if you had direct dyslexia. You wouldn't be able to go through that phonetically, figure out what that word is. Okay. There's also phonological dyslexia, and this is when you can read using the whole word method. You can't sound out words at all. And it involves something called the visual word form area. So we actually have a part of our brain, which is kind of fascinating, that really spends all of its time just like looking at words and going, hey, here's what that word is, and let's get that excited.
What kind of dyslexia would they not being able to read numbers? Because my little brother, he has like dyslexia with numbers.
Dyscalculated.
What was that?
Called dyscalculated.
Yeah, because it involves numbers, so it's different. Different brain regions, different process. Good question.
So how is direct dyslexia and phonological dyslexia different if both of them allow you to read sight words but you can't read these phonetically?
Direct dyslexia, you don't understand the words that you're reading. You can read out loud, but you don't know what they are. You can say the words, and you can read them, and so when you look at the word, like let's say for you, cat, you can say cat. You don't have to, it's a familiar word, you're going to say it, cat, but you don't know what that is. You don't understand what you've said. when you read it out loud. Does that make sense? Well, phonological dyslexia, you do know it is canon. All right, so here's that process of reading, right? So there's sort of two pathways you can follow: whole word, and you can say the word, and then phonetic. You're going to sound out the words and then move forward. This is basically just showing you graphically what we just talked about. Here's the visual word form area down here on the bottom of your brain, right? That's going to be activated for whole word reading. So we're going to be looking at that whole chunk, right? The whole sort of collection of how things look when they're together. There are subtle differences in words. This may or may not be easy for you to see. I don't know if any of you speak. They're already sort of narrowed down to a very few number of you who are bilingual. Some of you might read Arabic, Hindi, or Mandarin. I don't know. I'm assuming you all read English, right? I think I can make that assumption. But if you look at the word cars and ears, for those of us who have been reading English for a very long time, those are two completely different things, right? And they look completely different, and it's like, how could you ever get ears and cars confused? But if you really look at this, the only difference between ears and cars is like that, right? It's like this small little piece, right? And then cars just became ears, and they both mean the same thing now, right? So you can see why, looking at this from that sort of whole word perspective, those subtle differences are important, and we're able to pick up those subtle differences if we're familiar. Some of these other languages, again, if you're not familiar with them, the subtle differences in those characters and the series of characters might be difficult for you to determine, but if you speak one of these languages, your visual word form area is going to get excited with those the same as it is with English, because you're going to have, again, you're going to kind of find those subtle differences between those characters. Does that make sense to anybody? It's pretty exciting, right? Hang on to that visual word form area. All right. Let's briefly talk about dysgraphia. Okay? This is a writing disturbance. This is when someone has difficulty writing, right? So it's going to be, you're not going to have difficulty reading, but you're going to have difficulty writing. This is why it's even more important not to use the term dyslexic when you're talking about transposing letters that you've written, right? Because it's not any kind of dyslexia at all. If it's anything, it's a dysgraphia. Folks with dysgraphia, they write, and when they write words, they have difficulty either with whole words or phonetic writing. As you might imagine, if there's whole word reading and phonetic reading, there's whole word writing and phonetic writing as well, right? Some of you, even very long words. I'm trying to think, anybody have a really long name? Nobody's going to own up to that. I know who has a long name or not. I can see your roster, right? And so if you have a long name, you probably don't really sound that out, right? You probably don't go, well, I got to write a letter, and then write a letter, and then write a letter. You just kind of go, there's my name, and you're done with it, right? Because it's something you're used to. But if you write someone else's name, if you're writing a place that you've never been to, if you're writing, again, that fun word we just all learned, Mezzacumble. Obviously, I had to think about that a minute because I spelled it incorrectly. Then that's going to be something that's going to be falling to that phonetic writing. Questions about that? I'm not going to ask you too much about dysgraphia. All right. That's all I've got on human communication.